Welcome to our lecture on the skeletal system. Specifically, we'll be talking about the structure and function of the skeleton in our bodies. I'm excited. I'm recording this on my laptop, which is a PC, and PowerPoint has a lot of different features compared to PowerPoint on my Mac. So I can actually film myself and say hi. So hello. I'm not going to film myself for the entire lecture just because that would be awkward. But yeah, this is our skeletal system lecture, so welcome. In this lecture specifically, we'll be focusing on the functions of bone, and we'll be looking at, on more of a microscopic level, bone structure. And really, we'll be really focusing on the fundamentals of bone development, repair, and remodel. I want to highlight that labs 5A and 5B, these really focus on the actual bones of the body, and these labs are very detailed. One of the reasons that your lecture is short this week is because I want to give you more time to focus on those labs. These labs are very involved. It's really going over many bones of the body that you don't have to know for your quiz. So to help you with orienting you on what bones I want you to know, I've made a study guide on D2L where I've really focused and listed out the structures of the bones that I want you to know about. So definitely look at that study guide. You need to know all of them or review all of them to get points on your lab. But in terms of quiz 3, you really just need to focus on what I've put in that study guide. Joints is also the last section of chapter 5, and we're going to cover that in lab 6 next week. And so I'm not going to go over that information in this lab, in this lecture, but we'll cover it next week. So let's go ahead and get into it. So when we typically think of bone, we really think of bone or our skeleton as being made of bone, and its job is probably to support our body, right? Like if we didn't have a skeleton, we'd be kind of just a bag of mush. But actually, our skeleton is not just made of bone. It also has cartilage, which is like a softer tissue type. And while the main function of bone is to support our body, it provides kind of a framework for our muscles and our skin and our other organ systems to be supported within, it does perform other functions as well. For example, our skeleton works with our muscles in order to allow us to move in our environment. Portions of our skeleton, like our rib cage, our skull, our pelvic girdle, those really work to protect our soft organs. Our brain is a very vulnerable organ, and so the skull protects that structure of our body. We have a lot of soft organs within our rib cage that are protected. The bones of our skeleton are also really key for storing minerals, specifically calcium and phosphate. Both of these are really critical for proper nerve function and muscle function. Our bones also store fat. We have yellow bone marrow, which is our fat, and the bones are one of the main sites where our blood cells are produced. So both our red and our white blood cells are produced from the bone and then secreted into our blood vessels. So a huge variety of functions. We really rely on our skeleton to do a lot of key functions in our body. In terms of the overall structure of the bones, there are 206 bones in the body, and because of that, there are many different shapes, sizes, and because of those shapes and sizes, there are different functions that those 206 bones can perform. In general, though, this is looking at a long bone specifically in this figure. In general, bones are made of kind of 3 components. First is the periosteum. So the periosteum is a membrane that really covers the surface of the bone. It has a blood supply, so it helps to provide nutrients and remove waste. It also just kind of acts as like a protective cover for bone. And then bone itself actually comes in 2 types, compact and spongy. Compact bone is really what you think of when you think of bone. It's really what is the hard material that makes our bones super strong. But spongy bone is another type of bone that rather than have this like really hard compact structure to it, it actually has kind of more of these open spaces. Spongy bone in particular is where we find red bone marrow, and that is where our blood cells are created. Compact bone, there are usually hollow spaces kind of within that, and we will find other space filled with other bone marrow, specifically yellow bone marrow, which stores fat. But really there's three big components of our bone: the periosteum, the compact bone, and the spongy bone. And if we actually look at compact bone and spongy bone on a closer level, we can see where kind of those names come from. So these diagrams and micrographs are showing you some of the key differences that occur between compact and spongy bone. This diagram here on the far left is showing you kind of a pie cut of a long bone. So kind of if we, on the previous slide, cut kind of down the center of the shaft or the skinnier part of that bone. First off, we would see that compact bone actually exists in these ring-like structures called osteons, and they look a lot like the rings of a tree, and they kind of grow outwards like that too. They kind of, new rings kind of laminate themselves to previous rings. But notice that the center of the osteon is actually hollow, and it's filled with blood vessels and nerves. Again, our bone creates blood cells, so the blood needs to be able to gather those cells up so they can circulate through the body. But bone is also a living tissue. It creates waste that needs to be carried away. It requires nutrients that need to be delivered. And so the blood vessels are really critical for doing those things. If you've ever broken a bone, you know that it hurts a lot, and that is largely due to the nerves. Again, living tissue needs to have a nerve supply so that our body can sense changes to our bones and react appropriately. And notice that those blood vessels and nerves really kind of exit from that compact bone and they enter the periosteum. So again, that outer layer, that periosteum, is really critical for providing the beginning points for those nerves and blood vessels. If we were to actually look at a micrograph, so if we were to kind of like zoom in and look at a microscopic image of compact bone, we could see those ring structures again. And this picture, I think, just really nicely highlights again that kind of center canal that has blood vessels. But notice that as I'm circling in blue, there's also these kind of darker hole structures that we see here. Those spaces are actually filled by the bone cells themselves. Bone cells are called osteocytes, site for cell, osteo for bone, and basically they fill any of that empty space. So they kind of make these little star-shaped structures where the bulk of the cell is going to be found kind of in that large circle, but then they kind of make these extensions that poke into the compact portions of the bone. So again, there are cells that live in this tissue. They are living cells, and they are making sure that they are keeping that bone healthy. I do want to point out that osteocytes can't grow. So once these cells are kind of encased in this hard matrix, they're kind of stuck there, and they eventually will die. And so that's one of the reasons why our bones stop growing in adulthood, is because once these cells are stuck, they can't really do anything after being stuck. So we have compact bone. Again, we also have spongy bone, which under a micrograph looks very different than compact bone. Specifically, the biggest difference you can see is rather than being organized into rings, the spongy bone is organized kind of more into these just kind of lattice network kind of structures where we have kind of these bridges of bone, but then these open spaces. In a living tissue, those open spaces would be filled with red bone marrow. And then they're just kind of those spaces are supported by the bone itself. So notice spongy bone gets its name because it looks very spongy, whereas compact bone looks more compact. We've got these laminated rings versus this nice open kind of spongy structure here. And contrary to what we might kind of think of with the skeleton, we think of our skeleton as being this hard, rigid structure that's really strong, it's hard to break. It actually wasn't always that way. So actually early in all of our lives, we had a skeleton that was made completely of cartilage. So the embryonic or fetal skeleton is actually made of not bone, but cartilage. The reason being is that cartilage is much more flexible, and the cells that we find in cartilage are able to divide and grow. Remember, osteocytes can't grow, but cartilage cells can. And the fetus has huge growth demands that are placed on it. We start out kind of microscopic and we end up turning into a 9-pound baby that has to be born at the end of 40 weeks. So there's a lot of growth that has to happen during development. The figure here on the right shows a 16-week fetus, so about kind of in the 4th month of pregnancy. Most of the skeleton of this fetus is still cartilaginous, but there are some darker regions like in the jaw and looks like kind of like the forearm here, where those darker regions actually are bone. So what actually happens is that this cartilage framework is going to be replaced by hard skeleton throughout development. The development of the cartilaginous skeleton begins really early in fetal development, but by month 3 of development, that cartilage begins to be replaced by bone. And I actually want to look at the process of how that happens. So I've given you this blank diagram that shows the kind of the replacement model where we start with cartilage but replace that with bone, starting in fetal development all the way through childhood. So again, notice that at month 2 here on the left, all of the skeleton is completely cartilage. So we have kind of this framework that now is setting the stage for where bone can appear. By month 3 of fetal development, this is when bone is going to start replacing that framework. And specifically, it's going to create this structure called the bone collar. If we're looking at, this is examples of bone or fetal development in long bones. So notice again, we have a bone that is longer than it is wide. And this bone collar really forms at the shaft of the long bone. This is typically where the bone is going to experience the most force. So that's kind of the first place that bone is going to replace that cartilage. So we're going to start getting these hard deposits of bone, and this will continue. This replacement again begins at the bone collar, and the cells that control this are called osteoblasts. Osteo for bone, blasts meaning that these cells are immature cells. They're actually a kind of stem cell that is replacing this cartilage with bone. But these osteoblasts are going to be hard at work. By the time we get to 9 months, the cartilage within the cavity, within the shaft itself, has basically completely disappeared, and it's left a cavity. And that cavity is really important because that's going to allow the blood vessels to basically kind of invade and situate themselves inside that bone, which again is really important. Those blood vessels need to pick up red blood cells from the bone marrow, but they also need to deliver nutrients and carry away waste. Also notice that by 9 months, the ends of the long bones are also starting to be replaced with bone as well. And by the time a baby is born, at 40 weeks, if that's full term, we'll see that the shaft of the long bone is completely made of hard bone, but the ends are basically still cartilage. But there is hard bone forming, and we do see blood vessels invading that bone as well. So we are starting to form the spongy bone that we would see on the surface of the ends of our bones. But notice that at birth, a lot of the skeleton is actually still cartilage. And so really from birth through childhood, this replacement process is going to continue. By the time we reach kind of early adolescence, most of our cartilage has been replaced, but there does remain cartilage here and here. So kind of where the shaft of the bone meets the top or bottom portion of that bone. Those regions of cartilage are referred to as the growth plate, or you'll see epiphyseal plate as well. These growth plates allow the bones of kids to continue to grow. This is why kids can like shoot up from being like 2 feet tall to 5 feet tall in a matter of like high school. And so those growth plates are where we're going to see growth occur in bones during childhood. We're going to talk about this here in a moment, but eventually those growth plates will harden and be replaced with bone, and at that point growth completely stops. In adulthood, we do still also have cartilage, but specifically that cartilage is going to be found on the surface of our bones, where bones make a joint. So for instance, your elbow, your shoulder, your knee, your hips, the joints of your fingers, the surfaces of the bones that make those joints are covered in cartilage. And that's because that helps to reduce friction. It makes sure that your bones can move smoothly when they do move across each other. So we do have some cartilage as adults, but again, those growth plates are going to seal over, and really all of that initial framework that was cartilage in the embryo is completely replaced by bone. So let's actually talk about the growth plate and how growth is controlled. Hormones are really the prime regulators of growth during childhood. Specifically, growth hormone is the kind of biggest player in childhood bone growth, and growth hormone specifically stimulates growth that occurs at that growth plate. Thyroid hormone also functions here. It works primarily to make sure that growth is proportional. You don't want one leg growing faster than the other. You don't want one side of the bone growing faster than the other. You want to make sure it's all fairly equal. And then once kids hit puberty, the sex hormones also start to play a much bigger role in growth overall. This is when, especially with boys, we kind of see them shoot up and become much, much taller. So the sex hormones during puberty play a large role in growth, but they also are partly why the growth plates harden eventually. So while they help growth at the beginning, they are going to cause those growth plates to become hard bone eventually. For girls, that hardening occurs earlier on, between 13 and 15 years of age on average, whereas boys it happens later, from between 15 and 17 years of age. This difference in kind of time also helps to explain a little bit why boys tend to be taller than girls, but there are a lot of different factors, like including your genetics, that regulate your height. So it's not all just about those hormones, but hormones in general play the biggest role in regulating our growth during childhood and puberty. But even though as adults our bones stop growing, that doesn't mean that they don't stop being repaired. So bone breaks or fractures can happen anytime in life. Hopefully you're lucky and haven't experienced a break, but they kind of suck. Just an FYI, break or fracture, it's referring to the same thing. There's no difference between these two terms. But a fracture is going to occur when the force that you put on a bone is greater than the strength of the bone. Your femur, the bone that makes your thigh, it is the strongest bone in our body, and it's really, really hard to break because it's so strong. If you compare that to, say, your metacarpal, which is here, which basically the metacarpals are going to kind of make up the bones that you can feel in the palm and the backside of your hand. Those are your metacarpals. Those are a lot smaller, they're a lot weaker, so it's a lot easier to break the bones in your hands, for example, than your femur. Breaks in general occur more frequently in children and the elderly. In children, they occur more frequently because bones are softer. Again, they still have some cartilage, they're a little more flexible, it's easier to break them. They're not as dense yet as adults. And then in the elderly, we'll talk about osteoporosis here in a moment. But basically in the elderly, bone density decreases and makes those bones more brittle and weaker, so it's easier to break. There are a lot of different ways of classifying fractures, but there's kind of four main classifications that we'll talk about here. Fractures can be considered non-displaced versus displaced. In a non-displaced fracture, the bone can be completely broken or only partially broken, but the bone is still aligned. Whereas in a displaced fracture, this is always from a complete break and the bones aren't aligned. And in this x-ray, would classify this as a displaced fracture because if you've noticed, kind of the left-hand side of this metacarpal has kind of shifted compared to the right-hand side. And it looks like this is a complete break through that hand. So I would classify that as a displaced fracture versus a non-displaced. Fractures can also be closed or open. They are closed if they don't break the skin during the break. They are open if the bone punctures the skin. It's kind of like those really gnarly breaks that we see like on like Red Bull competitions and things like that. But let's actually talk about how, if a bone is broken, how that bone can actually be repaired. Because if you've ever broken a bone, it sometimes takes time, but your bone has healed itself. And we'll see that a lot of the processes that work in bone development are working in bone repair as well. So first off, when we break a bone, the first thing that's going to happen is that the blood vessels in both the periosteum but also kind of the center shaft of that bone are going to start to bleed. And because of that, they're going to create a hematoma or blood clot. What's going to happen is once this blood clot forms, there are a special type of cells called fibroblasts. Again, blast for immature cells. Fibroblasts are cells that specifically form the fibers of the connective tissue. Remember, there's things like collagen fibers, elastic fibers that we find in connective tissue. Those fibers are made by fibroblasts. So we'll break a bone, it'll bleed, it's going to clot or create that hematoma, and then fibroblasts are going to kind of start to migrate into that region. When they do, they secrete collagen. So they're going to secrete that collagen fiber, and that creates what is called a soft callus. And we kind of can see that in purple here in this middle figure. So we kind of see this bulge around the outside of kind of the break, and eventually those collagen fibers, they're basically setting up a framework and they will be replaced by cartilage. So if you notice, the soft callus in this figure is called the cartilaginous callus, to show you that kind of that everywhere there was a blood clot, it's now been replaced with cartilage. And this callus is going to act just like it did in the embryonic skeleton as a framework for new bone to form to seal that break. So in step 3, we're going to see our osteoblasts again our immature bone cells, and they're going to start replacing that cartilage with bone. And eventually that soft callus turns into a bony callus. And we also see that new blood cells or vessels can start to invade that space. And we're going to basically just work to seal the two ends of that break. Notice that as we've kind of gone through this process, the lump, kind of that bulging that was happening on either side of the break, it's getting smaller and smaller. Kind of the last step of bone repair is bone remodeling, where essentially what's going to happen is that bony callus over time will be remodeled to get that bone as close to back to normal as it can be. Sometimes there is still kind of a outward growth or like almost like a scar that gets left, especially for really bad breaks. My husband, for example, had like a complete break of his collarbone when he was a kid, and the doctor couldn't really align it as well as he wanted just because of all the muscles that pull on your collarbone, but so he has kind of like a bump that you can feel. So that can happen sometimes, but if the break's not too bad, you shouldn't have kind of much of a mark where that bone was healed. So eventually, during this remodeling process, extra material can be broken down and remodeled so that you have a bone that is just as strong as it was before it was broken. And what I want to talk about is kind of this bone remodeling process. So that's the next topic that we're going to look at, because not only is bone remodeling important during kind of the healing of a fracture, but this is actually a process that's occurring pretty constantly in our body to help regulate the levels of calcium that we find in our blood. So it's kind of weird to think about, but the cells of your skeleton are actually being constantly turned over. And I think it takes about 10 years, but every decade, your skeleton is made of completely new bone. So you literally can say you are a new person every 10 years because the bone gets completely turned over and replaced. And so our body is undergoing constant remodeling. This remodeling is under control of the thyroid and the parathyroid glands. And the reason that we have this remodeling is because we want to regulate the levels of calcium that we have in our blood. We're going to see when we get into muscles and the nervous system that the calcium ion is a really critical ion. In muscles, it's required for muscle contraction. In nerves, it's required for signaling between nerves or between a muscle and a nerve. So it's a really, really critical mineral that we need to have in our blood, and it needs to be maintained at a very specific level. It should be around 9 to 11 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. So there is a negative feedback loop which works to regulate and maintain kind of our calcium level at homeostasis. Let's first look at what happens if blood calcium levels rise. So for whatever reason, maybe you've taken a calcium supplement or you've just drinking a lot of milk. If your blood calcium level gets too high, this is going to so we have receptors that will then talk to the thyroid gland, and that thyroid gland is going to release calcitonin. And calcitonin specifically kind of works with our bones, and it increases the deposition of calcium salts. So calcium salts are actually what make our bones hard. And so when we have calcitonin, it's going to tell our bones, hey, start absorbing calcium, make calcium salt, and basically remove calcium from the blood. So this is negative feedback because our response, which is removing calcium from the blood, is opposite of the original stimulus. But also we can have the opposite happen, where we have blood calcium levels falling. In that case, instead of with the thyroid gland, we're going to work with the parathyroid glands, which again are on the back side of the thyroid. And in the case of too little blood calcium, parathyroid glands are going to release parathyroid hormone. And these actually talk to a special type of cell called osteoclasts. They have a funky little shape. They have like kind of this ruffled border. Their job is actually to chew up bone. So they literally kind of attach themselves to the surface of your bone and they chew on it. And when that happens, they degrade that hard deposition of the bone, and they're going to release calcium into the blood. So this is going to increase calcium levels, which will bring us back to homeostasis. So again, negative feedback because our response, increasing calcium, is opposite from our stimulus, which was decreasing calcium. So the thyroid and the parathyroid are working together to basically remodel bone, have bone deposit more calcium salt or have bone be degraded to release calcium into the blood. And this balance needs to be very tightly regulated. If it's not, we can have things like osteoporosis occur. So osteoporosis is like a disease or disorder where we see a loss in bone density in people. And what's actually happening in osteoporosis is that the breakdown of bone is occurring faster than the deposition. So those osteoclasts are really chewing up bone, but we're not putting much bone back. And what happens if we were to compare, say, the spongy bone of a normal bone versus an osteoporosis bone, we would see that the bone looks much more brittle. Notice that the spaces between those, like that lattice work of bone and this spongy bone, become way more open. In general, that lattice work looks more brittle and weaker. And that really is what happens. We get brittle and weak bones, which put us at risk for breaking our bones much more easily. There are medications that can be used to treat this. You can also take supplements like calcium supplements as well. But a really great way to basically just maintain normal bone density and to possibly prevent the onset of osteoporosis is through exercise. So what's kind of interesting is that anytime you put force on your bones, so if you're running or you're lifting heavy weights, anytime you do that, your muscles are actually pulling harder on your bone, and that signals to your bone that it needs to deposit more of those calcium salts. So essentially, by lifting weights or by doing like workouts that put your body under some pressure, that tells your bones that they need to become stronger. And so it can really work to offset the deposition, or sorry, the breakdown of your bone, and it can keep your bones healthy. Exercise, especially weight training, is really important for women. There's this myth that if women strength train, you'll become bulky like Arnold Schwarzenegger or those female bodybuilders. That does not happen. Yes, you can bulk up and you might gain some muscle mass, but to look like those bodybuilders, like those, or Arnold Schwarzenegger, you have to take supplements or steroids. So it's really not possible. We don't produce enough testosterone to get super bulky. Men too, weight training is really important for maintaining bone health. So you have one more excuse to get to the gym at the beginning of 2021, right? Or at least work out from home. All right, so that